this is going to be just to talk a little bit about some of the psychological theories kind of as they can be applied within criminology. So starting off with some classical conditioning. So this would be Ivan Pavlov. So this is also known as Pavlovian conditioning. Yes, it is the one with the dog. So essentially this whole idea is about learning happening when you have a conditioned stimulus that's paired with an unconditioned stimulus. And so the unconditioned stimulus triggers the unconditioned response. And so this happens all the time in real life through symbols. So first let's sort of go over, if you haven't or sort of forget the specifics of how this works, this is sort of a good breakdown of the Pavlovian conditioning, aka classical conditioning. So you have food, which creates salivation in the dog. So this is an unconditioned stimulus with an unconditioned response. This is just what naturally happens because dogs salivate when they smell or see food. So before conditioning, then the neutral stimulus, the whistle, there's no response at all, no salivation. So because a whistle doesn't make a dog salivate. However, then you have the conditioning process. The whistle is paired with the food, so that unconditioned stimulus of the food is then paired with a neutral stimulus and having that unconditioned response. So there's no conditioning yet. This is during the conditioning process, so it's still because the food is there is why the dog is salivating. But because the food is paired with the whistle, that after conditioning, the whistle alone is now the conditioned stimulus, which creates the conditioned response of the salivation in the dog. So before, the whistle didn't do anything, but now because it has been paired with the unconditioned stimulus, it is now a conditioned stimulus with a conditioned response. So we can think about this happening in everyday life through things like symbols. And so these are things that take on meaning because we've learned to make this association between things. So, you know, I tell my bunnies that it's breakfast time and they get all excited and do their cute bunny binkies, which is when they jump around in excitement. It's adorable. And so they don't have to see the food. They just hear me come down. They know it's morning time. They hear me say it's breakfast time. And so then they know breakfast is coming. Or, you know, we hear sirens and we know to look for a cop car and, you know, pull over or, you know, run, depending on what effect that's going to have on us. Or you might have something like if you have a domestic abuse victim and they may associate fear with certain objects that are used in multiple instances of abuse. So something like a belt or a wooden spoon or anything that's used as a weapon. Then if they see that thing, even completely out of context and not even in the hands of the abuser, if they see the thing, that thing will evoke the same fear that is associated with the abuse. So we see this classical conditioning happening anytime through any of those symbols. And then, so then we have operant conditioning. So this would be B.F. Skinner type operant conditioning. And so this is where we have the behavioral changes that happen in response to reinforcement and punishment. And so this is the sort of just an example of the Skinner box. And so this is where, you know, there was food was used as a reinforcement technique, a positive reinforcement. Then there was a shock generator here that could be used as punishment. And, you know, signal lights, a food lever. It was basically teaching the rat that doing certain things will get you food, doing other certain things will get you a shock. And so they learned pretty quickly what to do and what not to do. And then, so that's kind of how the Skinner box worked. But the important part here is that this sort of led to two different types of reinforcement and then two different types of punishment. So you have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is when you have something good added. So a reward is given in response to a behavior. And so then that means that this is reinforced, and so the behavior is likely to be repeated. So, you know, you give money or praise to kids when they get good grades. They're going to keep getting good grades. If you give people money to do their jobs, they will keep going to their jobs. If we stopped paying people for their work, they would stop working. It is that positive reinforcement that keeps us going back to work. But then also negative reinforcement, which is mistakenly sometimes seen as a bad thing, it is still a good thing. Negative reinforcement is still a reinforcing force. And so this is because something bad has now been removed, which is a good thing. So if something bad is taken away in response to a behavior, this is also reinforcing that behavior, and so that behavior will likely to be will be likely to be repeated. And so good example of this, you know, if you are feeling really, really guilty about something because you're hiding something or you have a secret or whatever, and then that guilt is relieved when you tell the truth, then you're going to be more likely to tell the truth earlier, or maybe right from the beginning in the future, because you don't want to feel that guilt. That release of the guilt was a reinforcing behavior. That means you're probably going to tell the truth more often in the future. Or, people getting out of prison early, if they're following the rules and behaving, that could be seen as negative reinforcement because the bad thing, prison, has been removed. So it was going to reinforce that good behavior. So similarly, we also have positive and negative punishment. And so these are both bad things, which is going to make it so that the behavior is likely not to be repeated. So positive punishment is something bad is added. And so again, the behavior is likely to not be repeated because if the behavior leads to something bad being added. So this would be some of your typical things within the criminal justice system, our typical sanctions like going to prison or fines or, tickets or whatever. So anytime you have a positive punishment, that means it's the addition of something bad in response to the behavior. Whereas negative punishment is the opposite, where it's now something good being taken away. So it is still a bad thing, and it still means that the behavior that caused that thing is likely to not be repeated because something good being removed is a bad thing. So this is a thing like, if you give timeouts to kids, and so you're, taking away their playtime, then that can be a form of negative punishment. Losing privileges, if you're grounded and you can't use the car or TV or video games or whatever. So that's something good that's been taken away from you. And so that's a negative punishment. Losing your license for, a DUI or excessive speeding. That is something good removed. It's now an inconvenience. You don't have your license. So you're probably not going to drive under the influence or excessively speed again. That's kind of the idea. So the one that is definitely the most problematic here, that gets confused the most, is this negative reinforcement. People think that negative reinforcement is positive punishment, and it isn't. So both positive and negative reinforcement are good things that are going to make it so that the behavior is likely to be continued. So if we look at our Skinner box, positive reinforcement could be the addition of food, and then negative reinforcement is maybe there's a slight shock that stops when the rat does something. Then it's going to keep doing that thing because it takes away that shock. And then positive punishment, if we look at our Skinner box, it would be, do something, you get a shock. That's a positive punishment. It's the addition of something bad. Negative punishment could be, I don't know if there was a way to put the food in there and then take it away if they do something. Or maybe if we're using like this, the sound, maybe there is a pleasant sound being made that the rats really like, and then it stops when they do something. That might be a negative punishment. So the important thing is that both of the reinforcements are good, both of the punishments are bad. So then social learning theory, this was Bandura, and this was the idea that we learned from others through observation, imitation, and modeling. So this is sort of a breakdown of Bandura's study. Essentially what he did is he had 3 groups of kids. One group, the first group, watched an adult beat up a little Bobo doll, which is kind of like what this thing is. It's those things that you hit and they're like full of air and they come back up at you. So they had one group of kids that watched an adult beat up the Bobo doll. Then they had another group watch an adult completely ignore the Bobo doll and play with another toy. And then the third group, which was the control group, they didn't watch an adult. They just were put in the room. So what they found was that later, the kids in the first group that watched the adult beat up the Bobo doll they beat up the Bobo doll too. So that's what they did. They did what they had seen the adult do. And the kids in the second group were even less aggressive towards the doll than the control group. So the control group, like sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But the ones who observed the adult ignoring the Bobo doll, they were less aggressive compared even to the control group. So they just kind of ignored it as well. So this tells us that this is something that, it's not just kids. Adults do this too, where we learn from others by observing what they do, imitating and modeling their behavior. And so criminality is learned just like anything else. And so if we see people engaging in criminality, especially if we see them succeed in criminality in the sense of getting the thing they want and not getting caught, then we are much more likely to imitate and model that behavior. And that's why when we see kids see, their parents using drugs or engaging in other criminal activity, like things like that, is going to be more likely to be repeated. And even if we go to non-criminal behavior, like even using alcohol and things like that, that becomes what they are going to observe, imitate, and model. Whether we're talking about like little kids and sort of learning that through their life, or it can happen in adulthood too. So this learning theory is criminality is learned just like anything else. Cognitive theory is more about, if we look specifically at our mental processes and perceptions, and sort of how that can affect our likelihood of criminality. So specifically, when we look at information processing, people who use information to make reasoned judgments more often choose pro-social behavior. And crime-prone people may then have some kind of cognitive deficits, or they use the information incorrectly when they're making decisions. And so there's something, different. Again, keeping in mind that we're not talking about sort of situational, petty type crime. We're talking about major crimes. There's going to be some kind of cognitive deficit, or they're not seeing things the way that everybody else does. So they're not using the information correctly. A big part of cognitive theory is cognitive distortions. And a cognitive distortion is a skewed or faulty cognitive process. And it is that cognitive process that guides the person's decision making. And so if it's faulty, then they're going to use this faulty process to then guide their decision making. So obviously going to cause some problems. And so then this sort of leads to not as great mental scripts. And so there's going to be a problem with the mental scripts. They're going to be inferior in some way. And typically we learn these mental scripts in childhood. And it's essentially just a way of our brain efficiently telling us what to do in a given situation. And so we have these scripts that we follow to make things easier so we know what to expect. And everybody has scripts, but then if we learn the wrong types of scripts, then that's going to affect our decision making for the rest of our life unless we fix those scripts. And so those cognitive distortions are one major fault that can happen within the mental scripts. And I mean, there is a ton of different types of cognitive distortions. So for example, there's a sense of entitlement, which is, saying that, the rules don't apply to you. So, I shouldn't have to pay the fine, even though I was speeding because I'm not as bad as other people. Or rapists often believe they're entitled to what they want when they want it, and that justifies a sexual assault. There's also a cognitive distortion called belief in a just world. And this would be something like, the poor deserve to be poor and shouldn't get our help because the world is just the way it is. There's also what's called all or nothing thinking. So, if somebody thinks, if I don't get all A's, I'm a total failure. That's an all or nothing type thinking. Another cognitive distortion is when people use their feelings as the basis for judgment, even if you look at objective evidence and it doesn't support those feelings. So for example, an OCD person who's washing their hands again and again because they don't feel clean, even though they've already washed them 3 times, and objectively they are clean, but they don't feel it. And so they're believing something a little differently. There's also delusions and holding beliefs despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So, thinking global warming doesn't exist, or feeling overweight when you weigh 85 pounds. So there's that distorted thinking. There's also cognitive distortions about blaming other people for your own misfortune. And this is often where retaliatory violence comes into play. And then there's the self-serving bias. So, this is a belief that, everything the good that happens to you is because of you, but everything bad that happens is because of an external factor or something outside of your control. And offenders think that way a lot. So these are only some of the many, many types of cognitive distortions. There's cognitive distortions specific to crime types, like there's specific cognitive distortions that child molesters will have, and rapists will have, and there's specific cognitive distortions that robbers will have. So there are also specific ones to specific crimes, but cognitive distortions in general just means that you have a certain thought process that affects your mental scripts, which then affects your decision making.